History as it happens, March 7th, 2023. Evangelicals and the road to Trump.
The Bible certainly is one of, if not, it is the book.
Somebody said to me the other day, "You're the most famous person in the world by far." I said, "No, I'm not. No, I'm not." He said, "Yes, you are." I said, "No." He said, "Who's more famous?" I said, "Jesus Christ." Most importantly, I brought my Bible.
Lord, I thank you that America didn't need a preacher in the Oval Office. It did not need a professional politician in the Oval Office, but it needed a fighter and a champion for freedom. And Lord, that's exactly what we have.
Over the past several decades, evangelical Christians moved from the fringes to the mainstream of Republican politics. They're now a dominant GOP constituency. Whoever wins the party's 2024 presidential nomination will need their votes. Will that be Donald Trump again? How did evangelicals wind up supporting him in the first place? That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Let we, the people, have the assurance of a fair and a just election. I thank you for President Trump. I put a hedge of protection around him. I secure his purpose. I secure his destiny. I secure his life, God. And I thank you that he will walk in a holy boldness and a wisdom, God, and that you will go before him. You will be his rear guard, and you will go in front of him this day and every day, God.
2 days before the second presidential debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in 2016, a conversation between Donald Trump and Access Hollywood host Billy Bush from 2005 made news. Breaking news just a month before the election. Trump was heard bragging all those years ago about how he approaches women.
Very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. She wanted to get some furniture. I said, "I'll show you where they have some nice furniture." I took her out furniture. I moved on her like a bitch. But I couldn't get there, and she was married. And all of a sudden...
Many pundits wondered if his lewd remarks would cost him support among the Republican Party's most sanctimonious constituency, conservative Christians. Well, in an interview on Fox News, the head of a Dallas megachurch, Pastor Robert Jeffress, put those concerns aside.
Well, let me be very clear about this. These statements were lewd, offensive, and indefensible, but they're not enough to make me vote for Hillary Clinton. Last week, I was in Trump Tower. I moderated a meeting between Mr. Trump and religious leaders. And I said, with Trump seated to my left, I said, look, I might not choose this man to be a Sunday school teacher in my church, but that's not what this election is about.
It's
about choosing the best leader to reverse the downward spiral of the nation.
But it's also about electing someone with character and with judgment. He mentioned comments that he's learned a lot after 10 years. He was still 60 years old when these comments were made. How much growth do you do between between 60 and 70 years old? Has his judgment really changed since then?
Well, let me agree with you. I do think character is a very important issue when it comes to leadership. But when people suggest that Trump is now disqualified because of his character, they're assuming that Hillary Clinton has a better character.
Now, maybe you're saying, what a hypocrite, what a fraud. How can anyone who considers himself a Christian support someone like Donald Trump, a cruel bully ignorant of the Bible? Well, yeah, of course. But hypocrites are a dime a dozen. Jeffress was at least honest in that interview. It's about power, not morality. He wanted a Republican in the White House who would appoint conservative justices to the Supreme Court, and no Democrat's going to do that.
But when it comes to family values, I would just say that the issue, I think, for conservative Christians in this next election is the Supreme Court.
In early 2017, with Trump in office, Jeffress was among a group of so-called faith leaders who placed their hands on Trump while the pastor led a prayer at the White House.
But Father, we also want to pray for spiritual healing, emotional healing for our country. This country has been bitterly divided for decades upon decades, and now you have given us a gift. President Donald Trump, who wants to bring healing to this country.
Throughout his presidency, Donald Trump made a show of his support from right-wing Christians. Here he is in early 2020 on a stage with the Evangelicals for Trump coalition, just days after Mark Galli's editorial in Christianity Today called for Trump to be removed from office.
Lord, I thank you that America didn't need a preacher in the Oval Office. It did not need a professional politician in the Oval Office, but it needed a fighter and a champion for freedom. And Lord, that's exactly what we have. I thank you, Lord, that he doesn't claim to be perfect, but he is passionate. He's passionate to stop the merciless killing of the unborn.
Well, the situation isn't so chummy today. Pastor Jeffress is remaining neutral when it comes to endorsing anyone for the 2024 GOP nomination, and Trump is now accusing him of disloyalty. Several evangelical leaders are calling on their congregants to move on from Trump, although they'd probably still vote for him in a general election rather than any Democrat. Why is that? How did the Republican Party become the home of conservative Christians, squeezing out more moderate and even liberal Republicans from the party? When did it start happening? Darren Dochuk is a historian at the University of Notre Dame, and his work focuses on the intersections of religion, politics, and culture. He is the author of From Bible Belt to Sun Belt: Plain Folk Religion, Grassroots Politics, and the Rise of Evangelical Conservatism. Darren Dochuk, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Martin. Great to be with you.
So, Darren, you're not only a historian of this subject, you also have a personal story to tell, or a personal history, if you will. You were raised an evangelical.
Oh, for sure. No doubt about it. In terms of my scholarship is driven by trying to figure out my growing up in an evangelical family in Alberta, Canada. My father was a preacher. I think a lot of what I've been doing as an academic has been trying to revisit those roots and try to make sense of them.
I was raised Catholic, now an atheist. So still very interested, though, in this subject, obviously. It's an important one. I've done a lot of episodes over the past year trying to explain right-wing populism today. How did we get here? George Wallace, Phyllis Schlafly, Pat Buchanan, the rise of the new right. I've talked about individuals, but also ideas and movements.
Well, it's clear that the Trump moment has been a culmination of several generations of political mobilization among evangelicals. It's the story of how evangelicals, I think, not just became aware of the usefulness of politics to advance what they see as a Christian cause, a Christian American cause. It's also the story of how politicians have come to realize the potentials of evangelicals as a voting bloc, and the culmination also of just how an entire infrastructure of media, grassroots activism, of partisan political strategy, precinct politics have all come together, really, literally with the personality of Donald Trump, speaking to evangelicals, again, after generations of moving gradually but deliberately to this moment.
But you said something there, bloc, a voting bloc. There was a time when you couldn't say there was a right-wing evangelical voting bloc. So when did this shift begin? Is it the 1960s, civil rights, Brown versus Board of Ed, which was, of course, the previous decade? But
for sure. No, it certainly is a Cold War moment. I think we need to accentuate that for sure. I would argue that we need to go back. And again, not to be the typical historian here, like, let's go back further in time. But I think, the post-World War I period, the 1920s and 1930s interwar period are also crucial. And I think a lot of excellent historical work has been done recently to make that point. Several things are happening in the immediate World War I period into the 1920s. In terms of theologically within Protestantism, we're seeing a very clear break between liberal progressives, the main line, if you will, and evangelicals who are going to label themselves in the 1920s fundamentalists. And they consider themselves fundamentalists because they are protecting the inerrancy, infallibility of Scripture as they see it in the face of trends that are historicizing Scripture, saying it's another text that needs to be critiqued. Of course, famously, they are battling against evolution and teaching of evolution in schools.
Scopes monkey trial.
Yeah, for sure. And in general are seeing kind of a liberalization or a secularization of American society. And you can picture what's going on in the 20s culturally, right? I mean, jazz, you've got flappers. I mean, all of this is worrisome to evangelicals who are going to become much more determined to kind of shore up the fundamentals of the faith as they see it. So I think that's a critical moment. If we want to look politically, it's the 1930s. Evangelicals are going to start to coalesce in a deliberate, well-articulated, if you will, anti-statist politics. They are going to become more fearful of the New Deal, of Franklin D. Roosevelt. They're going to see this as an infringement on their freedoms, be it personal, corporate, or religious. And they're going to sense a socialist drift. So
atheistic communism.
As you can imagine, that is going to become all the more pronounced in the 1950s and 60s, and that's kind of your entry point. So all that's to say is I think we need to look to pre-World War II circumstances, and then what happens in the wake of World War II is absolutely crucial. Within evangelicalism, we're going to see kind of a rebranding. The fundamentalists of the interwar period are now going to define themselves as evangelical or label themselves, and this is seen as a more ironic, culturally engaged term. They're also going to become much more assertive in fighting liberals in the Protestant church. The World Council of Churches, for instance, one of these kind of liberal progressive internationalist enterprises similar to the United Nations is going to, in evangelicals' mind, misrepresent what the Bible is about, which is supposed to be about personal regeneration. And then we're going to see several cultural political turns. And I think this is what you're alluding to with the 60s, increased secularization of American society, school prayer rulings, which are going to outlaw school prayer, for instance, is the most obvious in the early 60s. The counterculture, many of the more liberal drifts in youth culture that they see in the 1960s, all of this is going to be worrisome to them.
Yeah, feminism, abortion, gay rights, sexual revolution.
Yeah, so, all of the above. And then I would just say politics of the Cold War period is also going to be generative for them. In response to New Deal liberalism, they're going to become much more determined to be the staunchest anti-communists on the American political spectrum. They're going to support Eisenhower, but very quickly move to a much more aggressive, assertive foreign policy, cowboy conservatism of a Goldwater, for instance. And they're going to start taking ownership of the Republican Party, I think earlier than most would assume. So,
interesting.
Yes to the 50s and 60s as a pivotal point, with the caveat that we need to look also at the roots of this pre-World War II.
Well, we can go back to 1789 if you'd like. Religion's always been a powerful force in American society and politics. Abolitionists were deeply religious, but for a short podcast, we're going to concentrate on how evangelical Christians became conservative Republicans, took over the party, and maybe why it's so concentrated in one or two parts of the country, the Southwest and the old South of Dixie. So why don't we stick with the 50s and 60s then? You mentioned some of these, the reaction to some of the cultural liberalism that was happening at that point. How about school desegregation? Why was that important in this story?
There's no doubt about it. Civil rights, the efforts of the liberal establishment, the Democratic Party especially, to place the weight of the federal government against segregation on behalf of civil rights activism is absolutely crucial to the political awakening of evangelicals. Now, again, one caution here is that post-World War II evangelicalism is itself, certainly for the first few decades, still pretty amorphous. It is a large voting bloc of Protestants, if you will, that is itself divided. And that is typically between harder edge fundamentalists and more ironic evangelicals who are wanting to be more culturally, politically engaged, but also more centrist in their politics. And, if we want to think of Billy Graham as kind of the ultimate representative of that.
But this book teaches from Genesis to Revelation that this life is only a preparation room for eternity. There is another life. The Old Testament teaches it, the New Testament teaches it, Jesus taught it, the apostles taught it. If a man die, shall he live again? That's the question Job asked. That's the question that millions are asking tonight, and the answer from the Bible is a resounding yes.
Those who are tending as late as the late 50s, early 60s to be staunch segregationists are going to be more marginalized on the fundamentalist side of the evangelical spectrum. So I don't want to say that it's all evangelicals responding in similar manner. Particularly Southern fundamentalists are, of course, going to be the staunchest supporters of segregation. All that's to say is civil rights and the battle over that is generating new energy within evangelicalism broadly, especially within the fundamentalist wing. But it's going to take some time yet for the furor and the harder-edged responses to civil rights to dissipate before the Republican Party and evangelicalism are going to come together and in the 70s really form a more substantive union, if you will, and be able to move past with a colorblind conservatism towards the Reagan revolution that we see playing out in 1980.
Now, you're right. These ideas were there, but there really wasn't a political movement behind them. Involvement in politics, outright politicking, all the way up to what we see today, where this force is dominant in the Republican Party now. There aren't very many moderates or liberal Republicans left, and it's a highly religious party. So let's talk Nixon then, 1960s Southern strategy. You know, I think of Richard Nixon and even like Gerald Ford Republicans. They don't seem very interested in what we would call culture war issues today or religious issues. I'm not even sure Nixon was very interested in domestic politics versus, say, foreign policy, right? What kind of relationship did Richard Nixon have with this burgeoning movement of Christian voters?
For sure, absolutely crucial. I would, once again, though, just shift our gaze briefly to...
Sure, correct me all you'd like.
Another key politician, and it's all related, and that would be Ronald Reagan, but not Ronald Reagan as presidential candidate, but as governor of California. And when we talk about civil rights, as we just did, we tend to focus on the southern states, the deep south especially, and the crucial importance they are going to play, and evangelicals in that region is going to play to the reddening of the South and the reddening of American politics in the 1970s. I argue in one of my books, in fact, that the key regional pivot here is the Sun Belt South, Southern California, for instance, especially, which in the wake of World War II is going to attract hundreds of thousands of migrants from Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas. And they're going to bring their plain folk faith with them. They're going to enjoy the benefits of post-war affluence. They're going to move into suburbs of Orange County and so forth. And they're become natural allies of first Barry Goldwater and then Ronald Reagan. And I think it's Reagan in the late 60s who's absolutely crucial, envisioning a softer brand of creative conservatism, as he calls it, that is going to be deliberate in bringing evangelicals from that state into the fold.
Wow.
And so Reagan can talk to them as a governor candidate.
Well, let me interject here, though. Reagan signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the United States as governor in the 1960s. So I wasn't really aware of Reagan's allegiance or partnership, whatever you want to call it, with this voting bloc.
Great point, and that's certainly true. He did, as he moved later into his governorship, started to reconsider, I think, some of his early support for abortion. And I think that goes to the evangelical mindset as a whole. I think evangelicals were later to the game, if you will, where abortion is concerned than Catholics. And so they, too, really are going to take some time in the 70s to kind of latch on to abortion. But Reagan appeals to evangelicals in other ways. He is a free enterprise politician. Evangelicals in the rising Sun Belt of California are as well. So it's not just social issues, it's economics as well.
Barry Goldwater Republicans.
Barry Goldwater, right. They're fiercely patriotic. They have fought in the war, perhaps, or likely see their own family economics determined by their professional attachments to the military industrial complex in Southern California, which is so crucial. So there are other ways in which Reagan appeals to them. And institutionally, we see the growth of evangelical colleges and political action committees in California in the late 60s that are going to be crucial to Reagan's future. So all that's to say is I think Reagan is the first architect of this Sunbelt evangelical conservative agenda. And Nixon, another California politician, is going to, I think, seize that, and certainly with his own team through the Southern strategy, seek to reach a broader swath of kind of Sunbelt evangelicals from Los Angeles all the way to Atlanta to Columbia, South Carolina. And that is, again, kind of a more colorblind, centrist conservatism that speaks both to the priorities of social conservatism with a lot of patriotism mixed in, and also an attachment to kind of free market economics. That really is the formula that Reagan won on, and it's one that Nixon is going to win on.
I've always been a bit puzzled by the attachment to free market economics, capitalism among right-wing Christians. In terms of, what did Jesus say about this in the New Testament? I mean, maybe that sounds silly because, a lot has happened in the past 2,000 years. But I don't know. What do you make of that question? I mean, you were raised in this cultural milieu, so maybe you can help me out here.
There's, a few different ways to look at why evangelicals become so staunchly free enterprise in their politics. If we were to look at evangelicals of William Jennings Bryan day, there was always a populist impulse that sought to protect not just individuals, not just against big government, but also against big corporations. And I think by mid-20th century, evangelicals, those who may have supported a William Jennings Bryan earlier, are becoming much more confident in their ability to speak as capitalists. They are enjoying the fruits of post-war capitalism. And then philosophically, I think as they face the communist threat and as they look to New Deal liberalism, they are seeing religious freedoms and the freedoms of the marketplace together being challenged. And I think in their minds, they see those as twin fears that need to be responded to, not just through advocacy of social family values politics, but also of fiscal politics as well.
Your remarks here remind me of why I often view this movement as less a religious one and more of a political one. It's often joked that Jesus Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, didn't talk about gay rights and abortion very much, but he talked about helping the poor, healing the sick. He was a critic of the Roman Empire. Yet modern-day evangelicals are well to the right, and they support a muscular foreign policy. I don't want to conflate today's evangelicals with the ones from the 1960s. Maybe they are quite alike, but Kevin Phillips, one of Richard Nixon's strategists, he said it had to be a tempered conservatism in those days. You had to avoid outright racist language. You had to court white people outside the Deep South to grow the base.
For sure. And I think this highlights the changes that have happened within evangelicalism and the politics of evangelicalism since the 1970s, the early 70s, when Kevin Phillips was coming up with a Southern strategy. So there was more of a centrism for sure at that point. Listeners today might be surprised at just the range of political concerns that evangelicals circa 1972 had. Some of them, many of them speaking to issues that you just raised. Wariness with an overbearing militarized state and its activities abroad in very imperialistic manners, be it in Asia, Africa, so forth. There are many evangelicals, many young evangelicals, who are absolutely advocates for environmental concern. They were environmentalists to the core. So there were a range of issues that you might associate more clearly with the Gospels than we recognize today when we look at the evangelical right. So, all that's to say, again, that I think evangelicalism itself has evolved in some really striking and important ways since the days of Phillips and Nixon.
Social justice, right? Where's the social justice element in today's political Christianity?
Well, you're right. Now, to add a layer of complexity to this, I think what we often associate, and rightly so, with modern evangelicalism is the politics of the religious right as it's being conveyed through media, as it's being conveyed through Trump agenda politics and so forth. There is, even in this moment, a broader range of activism going on under the canopy of evangelicalism, much of it very much geared to human rights advocacy on a global scale, world vision.
Charity, right?
We can list off the different philanthropic agencies that see millions and millions of dollars being funneled out of churches, and also moral support, and also involvement by evangelicals. I think that is a key part of the story that adds a layer of texture and complexity to our understanding of modern evangelicalism that also needs to be recognized, and that more often than not gets lost in representations of the religious right. Some of the concerns that you highlighted are still very much the concerns of a whole lot of evangelicals. And I think a lot of evangelicals in recent politics have tired of the Trump moment, and I think are looking all the more to those kinds of outlets for activism, evangelization that do not carry the same weight.
You're right. It's not all about abortion and gay rights. There is more to the movement than that. But let's talk about abortion in Roe versus Wade, 1973. If we're trying to explain how did this movement get so involved in politics and come to dominate the Republican Party, is abortion the most important issue of all? Nothing's monocausal, as I'm often reminded, but abortion is something to react to, right? To respond to and to wage a campaign to reverse Phyllis Schlafly. She was instrumental in getting the pro-life movement into the Republican Party, which took a while.
The radical feminists who look upon the right to kill the unborn baby as the premier woman's right.
I would like to thank my husband Fred for letting me come today. I love to say that because it irritates the women's livers more than anything that I say. The women's liberation movement is basically a very negative attitude toward life.
When you make the laws apply equally to men and women, you end up taking away many of the rights that women now have.
The left-wing professors today are extremely intolerant.
When you've spent these years doing dishes and diapers, you've got a living, breathing, loving, good citizen to show for your efforts.
Let's remember, well into the 1990s, someone like Susan Molinari could give the keynote address at a Republican National Convention. She was a pro-choice Republican. No pro-choice Republicans, insofar any exist, would be giving speeches at today's RNC. I went a little bit far afield there, but let's go back to Schlafly and Roe versus Wade. I mean, how important was that in this narrative?
Well, must not underestimate Roe v. Wade and abortion as a single issue that really sparked a new level of political awareness and activism among evangelicals. Evangelicals as a whole are going to come to appreciate, I think, their conservative Catholic counterparts because of this issue. Theologians within evangelical circles, late to the game, again, as I said earlier, as well as those sitting in the pews and those preaching from the pulpits, are going to come to the abortion issue through their observation of their Catholic counterparts, of the work of Phyllis Schlafly and other women. They're going to learn quick, where you have Phyllis Schlafly, for instance, being a champion of this agenda. Beverly LaHaye is going to join her quite quickly. Beverly LaHaye is, the wife of Tim LaHaye, famous pastor, who's going to help orchestrate the religious right in the late 1970s. She's based in San Diego. Through her organization, Concerned Women for America, she's going to bring evangelical women into the mix and together help fight this cause against abortion. As we know from Phyllis Schlafly's career, at the very same time, you've got the Equal Rights Amendment, so anti-ERA activism is also going to be part of this formula, as well as in the later 70s, gay rights. It is Roe v. Wade, no doubt about it, but it's part of a constellation, really, of issues surrounding gender, sexuality, and the home that are cumulatively and collectively generating this anxiety and sparking evangelical activism in a manner that had never been witnessed before.
Seems this is happening as our political parties become more polarized as well. As evangelicals became more and more influential among Republicans, you see fewer, as I mentioned, Susan Molinari, Christine Todd Whitman, George Pataki type Republicans in the party, to the point now where it's a conservative party and the dominant conservative strain is the evangelical one. When is that completed by, roughly? Is it the George W. Bush presidency?
George W. Bush, I think, is a moment where the success is more evident. By then, the religious right activists within evangelicalism have learned some lessons. They are no longer focused simply on presidential politics. They are going to shift their gaze and their energy to precinct politics by the late 80s, early 90s, and then have George W. Bush come along and represent the best of both scenarios, right? He, in his own way, is authentically evangelical. He has a conversion experience that he can testify to in a way that Reagan couldn't. He is going to have, therefore, kind of the top-down authority that evangelicals are very enamored with, even as, by that point, the Christian right, Ralph Reed and so forth, are going to have created an apparatus of grassroots activism.
That's right. So there are a lot of charismatic leaders here that maybe other movements don't have, these mega church pastors.
George W. Bush represents a region of the country where there are other concerns, too, that are very often theologized. Access to oil, the environment and the management of environment. There are other economic concerns as well that Bush can highlight and speak to within kind of these broader conservative evangelical frameworks. And so he appeals to them on many levels, and they in return are going to supply a leadership within the party apparatus. But finally, and to your point, I mean, I think there's just no doubt that the Trump presidency represents the coming together of all these various strands of interests, of politicking from the grassroots to the party level. 2016 to 2020 is the peak of evangelical influence. Where it goes forward, we will see.
Before we return to Trump and a couple of other contemporary or current issues, and maybe we'll even try to predict the future, although only fools try to do that. We've been talking about issues that conservative evangelical voters rallied around. Abortion, gay rights, feminism, anti-New Deal, anti-communism. There's also this notion, I hear it a lot the last couple of decades, that we are a Christian nation. What is the origin of the modern manifestation of that idea? What does it actually mean?
Christian nationalism, as evangelicals define it, I think is just the assumption fiercely protected that this nation was founded on Christian principles by men who were Christians themselves. What came after as a result of their actions, be it legally, constitutionally, or in establishing a particular arrangement of church-state relations and a culture itself, is all representative of Christian identity that evangelicals are wanting to hold on to as a last attempt to prevent a slide into secularism and the dark unknowns.
Sounds like a lot of this is a concern with what other people are doing. Minding other people's business, I suppose, is another way of putting that.
It is, and it's a concern, a heightened concern, again, intensifies, I think, after World War II as this nation becomes more pluralistic, more religiously pluralistic. If we want to look at 1965, for instance, and the new Immigration Act there, which really opens the doors to a broader range of movement of peoples from all corners of the globe, bringing with them non-Protestant, non-Christian faiths. This is worrisome to evangelicals who, while at least in rhetoric, have always been open to the religious pluralism of the nation, once they start to face the consequences of that and to see how their own authority is slipping in American society, or at least how they perceive their authority be slipping, they're going to act in response. And of course, that response is also going to be intensified, magnified by political operatives who see the opportunity through media, through party politics, to raise the specter of this kind of loss of traditional Christian Americanism, to raise the specter of the great other coming to this nation to chip away at the foundations of faith that this country has been based on. And the moment that we are witness to today, I think, are those fears raised to unprecedented levels within the evangelical subculture.
There's a new poll out by the Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings. 29% of white evangelical Protestants qualify as Christian nationalism adherents. 35% qualify as sympathizers, and a good number of them are Republicans, according to that survey. Why do evangelicals care that the U.S. Embassy in Israel is in Jerusalem?
Well, that's yet another element to this equation of evangelical support for the Republican Party, certainly from the 1960s forward, from 1940s forward, the establishment of Israel as a nation state. Evangelical end times theology very much depends on the literal ability of Jesus Christ to return to Israel itself, and they interpret that to be Israel as a nation state. And so
a bonkers theological, that is my bias speaking here, but in my view, that's nuts.
Evangelicals have always seen the world through their particular end times eschatological lens, and that goes back to the early 20th century. This is why they've always been staunch supporters of Zionism. When Israel was made a nation state, again, they were going to be its chief protectors. So yes, it's exaggerated, it's bonkers in many ways, but whatever you think of it, it has been absolutely central to their perception of this country's role in the world, and especially its role in the Middle East. And so what Trump did to move the embassy, absolutely crucial to their support for him. I mean, and they celebrated it. This is something that is biblical in proportions in their mind.
Yeah, and obviously, I guess I wouldn't care as much if it weren't such a provocative and sensitive, potentially explosive issue.
Well, no doubt about it. It is provocative, and in some ways that is exactly what's driving many evangelicals, again, not all, but many, those most closely aligned with kind of a Trump Christian nationalism, to provoke liberals, to push the envelope, also buys into a worldview that is very cataclysmic in its outlook. And evangelicals, through their eschatology, welcome kind of end times chaos. This, in many ways, legitimates their worldview. Their expectation is for a better world beyond. And so why not welcome chaos to justify their place in this world and the temporality of everything?
So, as you pointed out in one of your recent public presentations, 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump in 2016. But as we've established here, most prominent Republican politicians today embrace many of the same positions. They're going to appoint conservative judges who oppose abortion rights, right? So why Trump? Was there something about his personality that drew evangelicals to him rather than any of the other Republicans who ran in 2016 who are just as or even more conservative than Trump? He used to be a New York Democrat, you know? Is there something about his authoritarian leanings that they like?
For sure. You know, we've done our best here to trace briefly the rise of evangelical politics, politicking since World War II, for sure. They have become very practical, very pragmatic in their politics because they are savvy in a way that they weren't generations ago. And so when they looked to Trump, there's no doubt about it. They saw someone who could lead them to the promised land. And that was reversing Roe v. Wade. It's about abortion. It's about protection of particular traditional notions of gender. It is about support for Israel, as we just highlighted. And it's about defense of religious freedom as they define it in their narrow terms. So practically speaking, the 81% who supported Trump in 2016 clearly were bringing that with them to the polls and to the decision process. But I think, as you're pointing out, both philosophically and in terms of personality, there was a lot about Trump, perhaps surprising in retrospect, that also appealed to evangelicals. What was happening within evangelicalism, I think, matters. There was a leadership change. You know, if we want to look at Billy Graham as kind of the patriarch of mid-century evangelicalism, his son Franklin Graham is really representing that in a later 20th, early 21st centuries, and a very different personality, someone who is much more aggressive and assertive in his politics and friendly to Trump as a result. I think theological shifts in evangelicalism, which we don't have time to get into, are also important, but kind of the shift to masculine, hyper-masculine, patriarchal, dominionist understanding of evangelicals' place in American society, protection of whiteness, part of that, isolationism, all of that is resonating in a new way within evangelicalism that it didn't 20 years ago, I think. And then personality matters. Trump, the charismatic leader, is what has driven evangelicalism through time, back to the 19th century, to be inspired by a charismatic preacher.
Itinerant preachers, right, yeah.
Itinerant preacher, yeah. And this is someone who speaks your language. This is someone who's plain speaking, no nonsense speaking. And then Trump also, I think, represented the bootstrap free market economic mythology that so many evangelicals have bought into, and some in more charismatic prosperity gospel circles, right, are embracing Trump as representative of this kind of true capitalist warrior. So for all those reasons, I think Trump appealed to evangelicals in a way that I think most commentators and most academics couldn't really understand at the time. But since then, I think have been processing in some very fruitful ways.
We all know that hypocrites are a dime a dozen, but it did rub a lot of people the wrong way, that the folks who shout the most about morality backed someone who was cruel, had how many wives that he cheated on, etc. I mean, I don't really care about the man's personal peccadillos. You know, that's not how I judge politicians, but that's how many evangelicals judged other politicians, but they gave Trump a pass. At least some of them did. I don't want to generalize too much here. Some big-name evangelical leaders who have come out against Trump in recent years, that this is not where our movement should be going, in fairness.
For sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point. You know, as we've tried to highlight throughout, I think evangelicalism today is at war with itself over this very issue. I think perhaps now with some of the victories won, evangelicals will be more willing to measure just who they are supporting and to be perhaps a little more careful in personalities that they're endorsing. But it also, again, as you say, speaks to, I think, the changes within evangelical politics since the 70s. You know, you think of the moral majority. I mean, they were all about, of the late 70s, early 80s, they were all about identifying leaders who represented and stood for their sense of morality, and Ronald Reagan was one of them. Since then, I think they've become much more realistic in their political outlook and recognize that politics is dirty and it requires a pragmatism that is not necessarily lined up entirely with the idealism that they once championed. So Trump was that decision for them. What is the greater gain here? What is the bigger victory here? And what sacrifices and compromises do we have to make? And they made them.
And now they got the victory, right? Roe was overturned.
And they got the victory. They got multiple victories. But
I guess, sorry to interrupt, Darren, the irony is that Donald Trump apparently privately believed that the overturning of Roe turned out not to be a victory. He said that this is going to hurt Republicans in the midterm elections, and he blamed evangelical leaders like Jeffries, who I mentioned at the top of our conversation, for not doing enough to defend him, his record, and that decision. As an explanation, well, he's a narcissist, so he blames everyone else. So.
Yes, well, exactly. And ironies abound. There's plenty of irony and contradiction and paradox in all of this. And this is why I think historians are going to be writing about this moment. Historians of religion, historians of evangelicalism will be writing about this moment for quite some time. It does make for, I think, a very interesting 2024. Jeffers, the pastor of First Baptist Dallas that you've mentioned, is just one of many voices who are articulating concern and, authentic or not, are looking to alternatives going forward where perhaps the ideals of yesteryear, as far as politicians, ideal politicians are concerned, will line up more closely with the practical political considerations that they have going forward.
Last question. Has the rise of evangelical Christianity on the right been good for American politics? That's a subjective, well, it depends on who you are, right? Answering that one, right?
Well, I don't think so. I think what we're seeing in evangelical politicking in this country also reflects a more worrisome trend of kind of a transnational religious populism / authoritarianism that is doing great damage to the global order. So, no, it hasn't been. And I think, speaking as an outsider familiar with the dynamics inside evangelicalism, I think there's plenty of questioning going on within evangelicalism itself of whether this politicization, the level of politics that has been championed by evangelicals has been a good thing for that religious community. And I think increasingly we're seeing people say, especially young people too, saying, no, it hasn't, that we need to move away from the politics as core identity of what we are and what we stand for.
Well, if you want to stay pure, stay out of politics.
Agreed.
Darren Dochuk of the University of Notre Dame, we thank you. On the next episode of History as It Happens, 3 years of COVID. If we date the start of the pandemic to March 2020, at least that's when our lives in the United States are turned upside down. 3 years of COVID, what have we learned? We're going to be joined by John Barry, the great historian of the 1918 flu pandemic. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.